Hi there, folks. Eric from Hit Subscribe here, and this week I am doing yet another edition of the Freelancer Q&A that I do every week, or just about every week. This week I am actually taking a question that came up in a community I was in. Nobody asked this of me specifically. It was a question posed to this community, and I didn't really even answer it, but it struck me later as kind of interesting and something that this community might be interested in. So I noted it down and decided to address it today. And the question is basically, should I take a reduced rate to subcontract for an agency? So in this community, the people in there by and large are like freelance content creators. And one of them was saying something along the lines of, there was an agency that wanted to subcontract work to them, but the agency was typically paying out rates $20 to $40 per hour lower to the other freelancers than this person was typically going to make. So the question is, do I reduce that hourly rate down to match up with the agency, or should I stick to my guns and try to quote them a higher rate? Let's set aside for a moment how I don't like hourly billing ever under any circumstances, but it's super weird for content creation because the incentives are just the most perverse imaginable. It's kind of like, so I guess I could in a way forgive hourly billing for something, custom like software development, because going in, there's a lot of uncertainty. And you as a freelancer, a pseudo employee, kind of push the uncertainty back on the client, which is typical and more understandable when you're acting kind of like an employee. But for a very clearly delineated deliverable, like a blog post or a landing page, I just truly don't understand hourly billing, because if you think about those incentives there, it's I'm going to pay you to write blog posts for me, and the slower you are at writing, the more I'm going to pay you. Like, that's just, it boggles the mind. But anyway, setting that aside, let's bring this into the world of application development here, which I think most of the folks watching are probably more likely to be an app dev. So let's say an agency approaches you, and maybe you're a freelancer and you're used to charging, 150 an hour or something for app dev, and you know that the agency is only going to pay you 120 an hour or something. So the question here is, should you go along with that to work with this agency, or should you refuse, or maybe just try to get the agency to pay you $150 an hour since that's your rate? So let's dive into that a little bit. It's a nuanced question to answer, because the first thing I'm going to say here is it really depends on your needs in the moment. So if, for instance, you're in a dry spell and haven't had any work in 2 months and are struggling to pay the mortgage, all things being equal, I'd say you should probably adjust down your rates, get your bills paid or whatever. If, on the other hand, there are people knocking down your door to give you business at your full-on retail rate, then why on earth would you lower your rate? You could tell the agency, look, I've got my dance card full at 150 an hour. It doesn't make any sense for me to do less than that, and just see what they say. So first and foremost, to get this out of the way, you really have to size up your own needs in the situation and ask how much you need income versus how much you kind of want to try to bargain or negotiate or what have you. So let's set that aside and kind of zoom in more heuristic fashion to, I guess, what's fair in the agency world, what's commonly done, what makes sense. So I'm going to walk through all that. But before I kind of get into the idea of fair here, I want to be a little bit nihilistic, or at least realistic about this. I want to drive home this point. An hourly rate attached to a human being is essentially nonsense. It's vapor. So there, I think, is this misconception that your hourly rate, if you will, is some kind of property of you, like, as if you were in an RPG or something. You've got your charisma, and you've got your constitution, and you've got your hourly rate or something, and it's reflective of how valuable you are as a human being or how knowledgeable. Like, that's all nonsense. It is just a number that is tied to nothing other than your ego and the perception of your buyer as to the commodified price of your market labor. Meaning, if you say, I'm really good at app dev, so I'm a $200 an hour developer, that's nothing. Like, you just made that up. You reached into your backside and pulled that out and said, I feel like I'm good at things, and therefore I'm worth this much. It is just something you dreamed up. The only place that this starts to matter in the context of your negotiation is in your buyer's mind is the commodified price for app dev labor $200 an hour. So your buyer, who might be a director of software engineering, is going to have some kind of band that they believe is the market rate for the kind of labor they're conscripting you to do. So if that buyer thinks, yeah, app dev in Python is somewhere between 175 and 225 an hour, and you quote 200, they're going to say, oh, okay, that's in line with my expectations. If you were to go and say 300 an hour, that person would say, no, that's nonsense. I don't care what kind of, absolutely astonishingly good, whatever you think you are, it doesn't matter. That is not the market price for Python labor. I'm not going to talk to you. So it's really just a question of where, you pick this figure and decide that it's what you're worth. And does the buyer agree with that within a band? That's all that there really is attached to hourly rates. That's the alpha and the omega of that negotiation. The reason I'm putting it that cynically is just so that you understand your buyer isn't, I mean, ideally, if you're serious about having a business anyway, you're not going to like give them a resume and they're going to go and comb through and evaluate your merit or whatever. They're really just looking for labor, especially in this context. If it's an agency looking to plug you in on their existing rate sheet alongside a bunch of other people to do some kind of labor, they just have a band that they're expecting. And let me, kind of transition into the way all of this works, because that's a good transition into how this works. So understand, I mean, the agency, if they're going to subcontract work to you, they're going to vet you in the sense of, do I think this person is capable of competently executing this work in a way that doesn't make me look bad to the client? So I shouldn't say that your skill doesn't matter at all, but it's just up to a threshold. It's, can I plug this person in and they'll blend in along with all the other work that we're doing for this client and not embarrass us? That's the only real value they're going to place on your skill, is just, does it fit in within our band here? So it matters, but it doesn't really matter with you as kind of a unique individual with your own unique properties, and like that doesn't matter. They're looking to fit you into a rate sheet. So let's look at the way that labor is done. And I want to propose 3 different scenarios, and I'm going to walk through these in sequence. So one is that you're an employee of a company. Number 2 is that you're a freelancer working for the company, which is sort of like pseudo employment. If I can dig it up for YouTube, I'll link to a video where I talk in a lot of detail about like employment versus freelancing and so on and so forth. And then finally, I'll talk about agencies. So if you think about this on a spectrum of expense, an employee is the cheapest kind of labor. And the reason for that is that an employee gets a whole lot of benefits. There's this kind of like tight coupling to the organization. So if I hire an employee, I am taking a fair amount of risk as the employer, because I'm really marrying myself to you, the employee. I might have to pay unemployment if I need to let you go. If I let you go in the wrong way, you might come after me with some kind of equal opportunities claim or all sorts of other things. So there's a lot of messiness potentially in the breakup of an agency, or I'm sorry, a business with an employee. So you're really coupling yourself together. And because of that, because there's a lot of security with an employee compared to a freelancer or certainly an agency, that puts a depressing factor on the wages. You're getting a lot of perks. You're getting paid time off. You're getting, dental and, reimbursed travel and all kinds of other things. And society is making it difficult for the employer to part ways with you. All of that puts downward pressure on the wages. Next up, if you think about a freelancer, there is much less of a close association between the company and the freelancer. So it's much easier for the company to break up with the freelancer. Because of that looser coupling, the freelancer can command more money. The freelancer, after all, has to look after a lot of their own concerns, like in the US, health insurance, all kinds of other perks. There's no such thing as like PTO for freelancers unless you're a true like pseudo employee. So a lot of these perks that would go along with employment don't exist. The freelancer has to take care of that stuff freelancers take care of it for themselves. So the freelancer starts to be a more expensive proposition. And then finally, an agency takes care of even more than a freelancer. So if I, like take the bookkeeping agency that we have for Hit Subscribe, if I were to hire a freelance bookkeeper and then, that didn't work out for whatever reason, like sigh, now I have to go and find a whole other bookkeeper. There's labor that I have to do on my side. Whereas if I'm working with a vendor, they're deploying several different people to our account. If we don't like one of those people for whatever reason, or that person quits, working for that agency, the agency takes care of the backfill. So the agency makes things the easiest of all for anybody out there. They manage the most concerns, and they are thus the most expensive. Now, when we're designing, so these days Hit Subscribe will do consulting engagements like designing content programs that might be a mix of full-time employees for the company in question, for the client. It might be some freelancers that they, bring their own freelancers, or it might be running and fulfilling everything through Hit Subscribe. So if I am speccing out a program like that, the way I do math on these three labor paradigms is basically this. An employee is going to be a cost of X. So let's say that as an employee, we have an employee that's making $100,000 a year, which is roughly $50 an hour. If you are going to replace that $100,000 a year employee with a freelancer, then you can expect to spend about 1.5 on the low end to 2 times the rate. So let's call it 2x for easy math. One of the rules of thumb that I would offer if you are going and leaving employment and you want to get right out of the gate with an hourly rate is to take your annual salary and divide it by 1,000, and then that would be your hourly rate. So what I'm getting at is the employee making $100,000 a year. If you go off on your own and you're a freelancer, you might anchor your hourly rate at $100 an hour. And that's roughly twice the rate that you would have been making as an employee. $50 an hour as an employee, $100 an hour as a freelancer. And then if you want to talk about what an agency probably ought to cost fulfilling the same kind of thing, it's about 3x that employee rate. And that would be about $150 an hour for the same flavor of labor. This is all very heuristic and ballparky, but that's the kind of stuff that we're talking about. So just to fix that in your mind, employee is X, freelancer is 1.5 to 2X, and agency is going to be 3X. And the reason that those things are priced, if you will, the way that they are on average is because of the different things that they take care of for the client. So an employee is a very heavy relationship, and it exposes the employer to a lot of risk, and the employer is giving out bonuses and perks and benefits and all sorts of stuff like that. The freelancer, the client of the freelancer has a lot more freedom. They're taking care of a lot more things on their own, and the freelancer is taking care of more things on their own. So you don't have to worry about perks and holidays and benefits and all that type of stuff. And then finally, the agency is taking care of even more things, like backfilling. The agency is able to supply a lot of different people to provide a lot of different types of labor, if you will. So the agency is just a whole different layer of abstraction. And so you're going to pay a premium for that type of thing. So let's now, having set up that background for understanding, let's look at the situation of subcontracting. So remember that our basic players in the market are an employee, a freelancer, and an agency. Now, the situation that we're talking about here is that you have an agency, and for some reason, instead of hiring their own employees, they're going to hire a freelancer. So looking at the going rate for this type of stuff that I had cited, the agency is going to be billing $150 an hour. Now, for the agency to maintain a decent, what's called a gross operating margin, if an agency is billing $150 an hour, but they're also paying $50 an hour for that labor, they're maintaining a gross operating margin of about 2/3, which is a healthy gross operating margin. That's going to allow that agency to scale pretty far. I may do content about this later, incidentally, because I'm actually going to be doing a series of pieces of content about like running an agency 101 for our practice managers in the business. So anyway, I could get more into that, but I'm going to try to control myself a little bit here and not go through cost of goods sold and gross operating. Just for the moment, I ask you to take it at face value that an agency needs to maintain a fairly healthy operating margin on their labor. Otherwise, they won't be able to scale up more than like trivially. So you've got an agency who, in an ideal world, is going to bill out at $150 an hour for work that they are compensating their employees at $50 an hour for. Now, what we're looking at is a situation where, for whatever reason, and I'll go into the reasons in a moment, but for whatever reason, they are opting not to hire full-time employees to do that labor, but instead they're looking to bring in freelancers whose cost of labor is going to sit somewhere between what the agency bills out and what they would pay a full-time employee. That's the situation that we're talking about here. So with this in mind, when an agency subcontracts labor to a freelancer, it's kind of an interesting thing when you stop and think about it, because this freelancer is kind of a competitor it's fairly commodified. So what I'm getting at, though, is if you are a freelance Python developer and this agency is selling Python development services, there is a world where you two are competitors. So the agency's client is paying the agency for Python development labor, and you're over here also a Python developer selling Python developer labor. So it's not, crazy to say that you're competitors, but you are agreeing to put this competition aside and instead come to work under the agency's umbrella doing Python labor. Now, the reason I'm going so into calling you a competitor for this agency is just to kind of set the stage for what we're talking about here. So if you are a meaningful competitor for them and your rate is $150 an hour, and that is also the agency's rate, that makes sense if you're kind of on parity for charging the same amount for services. So you as a freelancer is saying, no, I'm a serious business. I charge $150 an hour. I'm an agency of one or whatever. You could opt to go that route and sort of represent yourself more at agency rates. Now, if you're going to do that, to turn around to the agency who's offering to give you work and say, I'm only going to come to work for you at $150 an hour, I hope you understand why this situation makes no sense for the agency. The agency's rate card says Python development is $150 an hour. You are going to consume that entire $150 an hour. So there is literally no profit in this, even gross operating profit for the agency. The agency has no incentive to do this. It doesn't make sense. There is a cost associated with the project management and the overhead of bringing you in. So the agency, if you were going to be on par with their rates, would actually lose money bringing you in. It would make no sense. It's not to say they would never do this. If the agency was really in a pinch, like their ace Python developer just quit and the client was breathing down their necks, they might temporarily lose money on an engagement like that, but it is not a good idea. It's certainly not plan A or probably even B, C, or D. So what I'm getting at here is there has to be a difference between the agency's published rate card and the rate that they're paying you as the subcontractor. Otherwise, it's a stupid thing for the agency to do. So right off the bat, you have to understand that it is reasonable for the agency to pay you less than the agency is collecting on your labor. They have to do that. And in general, I think that's entirely fair. So like, let's, look at this, for instance, from the agency's perspective. Why would your labor be worth $150 an hour? Why would your labor be worth the same amount as the agency's labor when in this situation, the agency is handling an awful lot of things for you? So the agency is just emailing you or whatever and saying, hey, I got work. You want to come do it? You aren't having to put sales calls on the calendar. You're not having to go out and do marketing or prospecting for that account. You're not having to win that business. And there is very real customer acquisition costs that exist. Likewise, you are not having to do account management and retention type activities for that client. You are also probably getting better terms for payment from the agency and more stable payment from the agency than the agency is getting from that client. So the client is handling a lot of things around business acquisition, account management, retention, billables, etc. They are taking care of a lot of things for you. So you could look at this as you are essentially paying the agency a premium to handle your sales, marketing, and account management. In a sense, the agency is acting like Upwork, so it's reasonable for them to take a cut from you. So to kind of circle all the way back to whether you should discount your rate or not, that's really a question that you have to answer. So if you really, for whatever reason, have a ironclad case and you want to be making $150 an hour, and an agency comes to you and says, hey, we also charge $150 an hour, therefore we're only going to pay you $110 an hour, it's not an unfair thing that the agency is presenting to you. It might simply be that there's just not that the price that they want to pay isn't worth it to you to do. And that happens all the time, where your rate just doesn't line up with their expectations and vice versa. So it's entirely fair for both parties to come to the conclusion that it's just too far apart and it doesn't work. But it is also entirely fair of the agency to ask you to take a reduced rate compared to what you might charge if you were going out and winning business from that client and working with the client directly. That's entirely fair because the agency is taking care of a bunch of things on your behalf so that you don't have to. So in the end, what I'm getting at, and the way I would answer this question is, should you reduce your rates to work with an agency? That only you can answer. But is it fair for an agency to have a band in which they're subcontracting labor? Yes, it's entirely fair. The agency is going to have preset math in place based on their own rate card that they're billing out, and they simply won't be able to make a business case to pay above a certain rate. So if this agency is charging $150 an hour, and that's their blended rate for Python app dev, and they're saying, look, the absolute max we can pay you, we love you, we think you're the best Python developer on earth, but it's simply bad business for us to pay more than $120 an hour. That is not them saying anything about your skills. It's not them trying to nickel and dime you. It's not them not knowing how awesome and valuable you are and what you're worth. It's none of that. It's simply an accounting thing where they're looking at their own internal metrics and how they can scale up profitably and saying, there is a hard cap on what we can do here, and it's this rate. So, should you accept a lower rate? You have to decide that for yourself. Is it unfair of the agency to ask you to come down in price? No, it's entirely fair of them to say this is the set of rates that we can pay, and if it's outside of that, we can't do it. So that is kind of how I would think about it. You can try to negotiate them up as high as you want, but if they refuse to go any higher, you shouldn't take it as any kind of statement about your skill level or your value as a human being. It's simply a matter of their accounting. So hopefully that is somewhat interesting and helpful for some of you out there, and I will catch you all next time.